Good morning, everyone. My name's Susan. I'm actually starting off the presentation. I'm the Academic Director for Intuitive Education, and prior to that I was the Deputy Principal of a large international primary school here in Riyadh. So the webinar that we're going to present today is going to provide you with a primary and high school perspective of how we've used assessment to drive improvements in student outcomes. As part of that, the webinar's basically in three parts. I'm going to talk about a little bit about the purposeful data collection and what we mean by this, and then I'm going to share with you a case study of a primary school that used data to improve literacy within the school. Then this is going to be followed by a discussion around how to design interventions that tap into students' likely potential, but along different pathways. And finally, Asma is going to wrap up by sharing a secondary school case study based on shifting the focus of teachers away from grades to progress. If learning is the purpose of quality education, then the main purpose of assessment within the classroom is therefore to clarify what's been learnt and to identify any gaps or misconceptions the learner might have. Assessment also creates opportunities for dialogue between the learner and the teacher to plan next steps and to set learning goals. School leaders, we constantly hear from our teaching staff and about workload issues. Therefore, our school systems need to be smart if we want teachers to put time into what's really important. We believe that we shouldn't collect data if we're not going to use it, and that any data collected should have multiple purposes. For instance, if we collect reading data, it could be used to inform next steps in the teacher planning. It could also help students to assess how they are progressing against their learning goals, and it can provide feedback for parents on their child's performance. As a school leader, I can also use that data to determine the effectiveness of intervention programs. And if a program isn't accelerating student progress to the degree that's needed, then why keep investing time and resources into it? At the class level, the teacher can make purposeful use of data to highlight specific weaknesses for individual students and to look at ways to address these gaps in the teaching and learning program. They can also use it to identify where specific interventions might be needed. For instance, a phonics program might be needed for a particular target group of students. And it can also help a teacher identify weaknesses or misconceptions that the class as a whole may have and use this to inform future planning. At the whole school level, senior and middle leaders can use data to inform the strategic planning as it gives evidence to support decisions as to where to focus resources and teaching. It's also really useful for us because it means that we can monitor the effectiveness of staff and identify areas of best practice and perhaps areas where practice needs some support. It also helps us to assess the impact of specific interventions or initiatives, provide reports to parents, and it also, a really important one for us, allows us to make sure there's alignment between the primary school and the high school. One of the things that we did here as a school when we were looking at how to transition our students from the primary to the lower high school was to actually sit down with the high school leadership team and talk about the data. This conversation allowed the primary and high school teachers to discuss achievement expectations and to get a feel for whether students were meeting these expectations. We then used that data to backward map to align the school curriculum. As we did this, we found gaps in knowledge and understanding between two areas of the school, and then teachers worked on developing schemes of work that would ensure we covered these gaps. In a very real sense, we felt that as an organisation, our students were not achieving because of what we were doing within the organisation. It's also interesting to note that as a result of that piece of work that we did, teachers in our upper primary school are now far more confident at challenging their lower high school colleagues if they hear them make statements about students that are coming through from the primary school. In particular, when a primary school maths teacher suggested that students moving up were lacking in certain math concepts, The primary school teachers pushed back and showed them data that negated that statement. For us, that's really important because it's moving the conversation sort of away from gossip, if you like, into a professional discourse, exploring what's being taught, what's being tested, how we can identify and address those gaps. In terms of our situation, we're a large international school, kindergarten through to year 12 in Riyadh. About 93% of our students are not English first language speakers, and we also have over 200 students in our combined support services department. These students range from children in our special needs classes through to students who are in the mainstream but receive academic support. Our staff are a mixture of local and overseas hire, and qualifications and experience are widely varied. One of the challenges we also face is that we often have our students for only a short period of time due to the nature of the contracts held by their parents, and this does have impacts when you're looking at data and improvement in outcomes. As an SLT, we realised that there was no systematic approach in school to collecting and using reading data. A range of systems were being used in classrooms. Some teachers were using running records, some teachers were using probes or benchmarks, other teachers were creating their own internal assessments, groups of teachers were creating internal assessments, and there was a real lack of consistency in the application and use of these assessment tools. As a newly appointed member to the leadership team, it was obvious to me that the data that was being collected was really only being used to report to parents, and that teachers were really completely missing most aspects of the teaching and learning process that data could inform. So as an SLT, we were looking for a robust assessment tool that we could implement, but we needed to get several things from it. We needed it to be manageable for staff, because once again it goes back to the workload issue. We didn't want teachers to be spending hours marking tests. It needed to be standardised so it would give us some really useful data. It needed to be easy to implement, and it needed to provide us not only with rich and meaningful data about the learner, but also with guidance for the teachers for planning and teaching the next steps. We also wanted it to be able to provide us with information about cohorts of students, so we could look at particular areas of the school where we may have had concerns. We were aware of the need of a mind shift within our teaching, that this was needed within our teaching cohort, and that they needed a tool that would support this change. That is, we wanted them to use data to identify gaps in student learning. After looking at a range of providers, we found that the GL New Group Reading Test, the NGRT test, would best meet all of these needs. So as part of the change management plan around this data, around getting teachers to use data, we decided as an SLT that we wanted our teachers to focus on reading. Using NGRT reading results that are shown here on the screen, teachers were asked to inquire into the students in their class who were achieving at just below, so stay 9-4 on the NGRT test, and in each class there were about 4 to 6 students, I guess, who were achieving at this level. These students then became the focus group for the teachers for the rest of the year. We had a belief that if we could help teachers to improve the outcome for these students, that would have a positive impact on the outcomes of all students. One of the things that was key to the process was that teachers had to really get to know these learners in greater depth. So as part of the inquiry, we gave them a template similar to what's on the screen to help them triangulate the data. They were looking at the NGRT data, they were comparing with their reading record data, they were looking at the results of spelling tests, any of their anecdotal teacher notes, or things to do around teacher judgment, and any information around things such as attendance or maybe special learning needs that might impact on the student progress. At this point, teachers also identified where they thought additional testing might be needed. So for example, if a student was really struggling, there may have been another sort of test that they could use that would give them a bit more information that would help confirm their assumptions around this learner. So then we worked with teachers, and in particular the middle leaders, because the middle leaders were going to cascade a lot of this messaging down to the team level. And we worked with them to identify the interventions that could be put in place in the classroom teaching and learning program. To encourage teachers to read the NGRT reports, individual reports, which you can see an example of on the screen, we introduced regular discussion at team meetings of what they were doing with this focus group of readers. And that was an expectation that each week or fortnight, the coordinators or the team leaders would actually, as part of their team meetings, would have this as a focus. So the recommendations in the NGRT individual reports were then incorporated into literacy lessons, and they were turned into deliberate acts of teaching. For example, the teacher might use a think aloud to model the process of what they do when they come across a word they don't know in a text. Or we ask teachers to make it very explicit to their learners about what competent readers do when they're reading. For example, when competent readers come across a word they don't know, they recheck the meaning. They see if the word makes sense. Or they use what they know, they use their prior knowledge in order to be able to predict what might be happening in the story. And going back to my first point, there was also this notion that there was an expectation that puzzles of practice were a regular part of team meetings. Puzzles of practice are basically just when teachers bring information to the team, information and data to the team around a student or a group of students who are not making the required or expected progress. The teacher talks about strategies they've already used, how they felt they've worked, whether they have worked, whether they haven't worked, and then the team tries to assist their colleague by suggesting possible interventions. Now, these puzzles of practice really helped to raise the individual accountability around the effective use of data, because there was an expectation that every member in the team would take a turn at bringing the data and the information to the table for discussion. At the end of the year, the students that had been the focus group, so these are the students who had started out at Stay 9-4 and had been the focus of the teacher inquiry, they then sat the NGRT test again. The NGRT results showed quite clearly that 95% of the students had made progress. 30% of them had made significant accelerated progress. We were really excited about this, as our Hard to Shift group had indeed shifted, and there was certainly a lot of celebration within all the teams about that as a result of all their hard work and the effective use of data, students had made great progress. For us as a primary school, the next step is to introduce John Hattie's notion of effect size into the analysis of data. This would allow us to identify the rate of progress that students are making and ask ourselves whether it's acceptable. It would also be helpful for us to be able to identify the teachers who are having the greatest positive effect on student progress and to use them as models of best practice, opening the door on their practice to other teachers. This would mean that teachers inquiring into their practice and this means that those teachers would need to identify really what they do that makes a significant difference of the learner, and this is something that we would cascade down to other teachers. Key to this is really that they know their learners and that they use data to inform teaching and learning. After all, as Deming says, without data, all anyone has is an opinion. I'm now going to hand you over to Jennifer, and she's going to talk to you about Cat 4 and how this can be used to strengthen teachers' knowledge of their learners.
Thank you, Sue, for that. Okay, so now we're going to talk about Cat 4, what it is, and how it can help us add another layer to the information that we have about our students in school. So what is Cat 4? Well, it's a cognitive ability test, and the 4 is diversion. So don't worry too much about what the number 4 stands for, but the cognitive ability part is really what we're going to focus on today. So some of you may be aware that several years ago, the Education Endowment Fund, or the EEF, in the UK, held a study based on what helped student progress the most versus value for money. The number one thing was feedback and marking, but the second most effective tool to help students make the most progress, that is the best value for money, with teachers using a metacognitive approach to their teaching. So this could be either through their planning, through their questioning, anything to do with their teaching in general. So that was the second most effective tool for helping students make progress. And that is why the CAT4 testing is really possibly incredibly useful nowadays when we're thinking about progress, because the title of this section, of this section, is One Destination, Different Pathways. Now, we all have those students in our classes that we know will get there, but they're going to do it slightly differently than anybody else. And that's okay. The beauty of the CAT4 means that we will have that information to help us know how to get those students to that particular place. So when the CAT4 is completed, the teacher will receive several results. The leaders will receive results as well. They're all different. Now, one of the things that needs to be said straight away is that you cannot study or prepare for the CAT4 test. It is a measure of potential. It shows you where the students could get to if their particular skills are honed into. It is not an IQ test. That needs to be made very, very clear to teachers, to leaders, to parents, particularly to parents in an international setting, very early on. CAT4 measures the potential a child may have if their skills are honed into. It is not going to be improved at all if you study for it. As you can see, you will receive, there are 4 batteries within the test. The verbal reasoning, which is where somebody thinks predominantly with words. Quantitative reasoning, where somebody thinks predominantly with numbers. Non-verbal reasoning, which is thinking with shapes. Or spatial, which is thinking with shapes and space. Now, let's make it clear. A lot of our students will be able to access all 4 of those batteries, will be average across all 4, and will be able to use numerous thinking skills. What CAT4 does is it shows us who the students are who perhaps can't, or who have a particular strength in one of those areas. Therefore, as teachers and leaders, we can then plan, adapt, look at resourcing, look at staffing, etc., based on our classes. So that's really what the results, etc., will show us. They will show us who in our classes is particularly set to 1 or more of these batteries. So using CAT4 in our mark sheet. As teachers, when we do tests with children, we tend to get a raw score. And that tells us, how well the student has prepared for that session, etc. CAT4 is different because we get a standardized age score. And what that is, it's their raw score that is adjusted by their age. It's a really useful tool because it helps us as teachers and leaders to compare students with everyone else who took the test. So we can look at them based on their cohort, and we will see where the child is sitting within their cohort. If 100 is going to be the average score, we give 90 to 110 to be the average band. So students between those would be classed as average across the board. Students, it may be noted, within a standardized age score of above 127 could potentially be classed as gifted in the top 4%. But of course, as stated before, CAT4 is a measure. It shows potential if tapped into. So teachers may get some surprises when doing these tests. Some children may come out and you may not have known that they had a strength in say, the verbal side. Some students, you may already know this information, but this will be the icing on the cake. This will be your clarification to know that, yes, they definitely do have this skill. It's up to you as a teacher or a leader now to really tap into it. As well as getting a standardized age score with each battery, the child will be placed on a STAI9. And a STAI9 is a scale. It's 1 to 9, 1 being low, 9 being high. And that gives a very broad overview of the performance. Many schools here in the UAE use that to give that information to parents rather than a score, because they feel that if they give a score, the parents will want that score improved year on year. And we know that is not what CAT4 is about. So they will perhaps give the C9. And that's easy to understand as well. It's a 1 to 9 scale. You can take it and you can run with that information. So that is how we can adapt perhaps reporting, whether it be to governors, parents, any type of stakeholder. A lot of schools here will also perhaps give that information to the child rather than give the description, as you can see above on where the green writing is, the very low, below average, average, etc. They will just give the STA9 and they will say it's between 1 and 9 and the STA9. Because you obviously don't want to be dimming anybody's confidence, etc. with this, but you do want to give certain pieces of information. So again, when you do the CAT4 testing, you will receive what is known as a profile about the student, and it needs to be known that the majority of our students will come out with no bias. The white box here, these coloured lines down the side. The majority of students will come out with having no bias whatsoever. They have an even profile. As I said at the beginning, they can think across using all of the batteries. Some students will come out with a mild bias, whether it be verbal or spatial. If that's the case, many schools in practice I've seen will have those children highlighted, perhaps on teacher planners, just so whoever takes the class is aware that that child might need additional questioning, might need a different or an altered form of marking and feedback, or potentially need something explained in a slightly different manner. Children who will perhaps come out with having a moderate bias, they're likely to be the children who will be on an in-school intervention plan. So the children who will perhaps receive additional lessons outside the norm, or will perhaps work with a learning support assistant, depending on their need. Normal interventions, we know, last 6, 8, 12, whatever weeks. Interventions based around CAT4 are different, because remember, it's not about IQ. You're not teaching knowledge. Your teaching is about how these children are thinking, how they approach things. It's about perhaps changing the skills that they use. Therefore, this may be an ongoing intervention. This may be something that the child will receive for a year, for 2 years, for their whole school career. Children who come out with having an extreme bias, you will probably know already, depending if they have an additional learning lead. And the likelihood is they possibly do. You may know who this child is already, and this may be an added piece of information as well, whether it's an extreme verbal or an extreme spatial. They are the children who will perhaps receive additional support from outside agencies, as well as the support that you will be offering them in school. As with the moderate children, their support will need to be as ongoing rather than a short-term intervention. This will be something that will go on for a period of time. And then, of course, you can then measure the progress that these children make yearly. As well as receiving that information about the bias, you will then also receive information that tells you about how to help, how to support these students. So for example, here we have a child with an extreme verbal. It says that those students excel in written work. As I said at the very beginning, you may get some surprises. There may be students who you didn't know. There may be students who you did know, but aren't using their skills that they have. So these are some hints and tips for teachers. In the best practice across the UAE and internationally that I've seen recently, planning is adapted specifically around these bias. So in one school, I saw that they use a grid and it's split into 4, extreme, moderate, mild, and no. And that's how they do their planning. So the teacher will write specific questions or questioning strategies that they will perhaps put into every lesson based on the CAT4 results. Because remember, this is how the children think. This is their potential. So this is really about where you need to be basing your lesson. You're also going to see that it'll say things like children with an extreme verbal, for example, are going to be high achievers in other subjects. They're going to be very verbal. That doesn't mean that they're not going to have any success in numeracy, in mathematical subjects, in STEM subjects. They will be. The key to this as teachers is to make sure that they make that progress in those other subjects now that you know about their metacognitive approaches. Your task is to get them to excel just as well in other subjects as they do in perhaps the subjects that require the verbal. And that's the information that you will get based on the CAT4. You will get that information, but it's how you're actually going to use it. If we look at spatial, a child who perhaps has a spatial bias, from the point of view of an international inspection, I know that recently schools have been questioned quite heavily on their CAT4 data. And when it comes to spatial, we have had teachers of STEM subjects asked quite a lot about who their moderate students are with a moderate spatial bias, or who the students are with extreme spatial, and what the teachers are doing about it, how they are addressing those spatial bias. What is it? What additional things are they doing for those students? Some people will ask about EAL students as well. Those students are likely to be, everywhere in this international setting. Therefore, we need to take into account that, how are they going to fare in the CAT4? They will be able to use or access 3 parts of the CAT4 test. The only part they wouldn't really be able to is the verbal. Some of them may come out as having a verbal deficit. That's okay. What we need to do over the course of the year then, as teachers and leaders, is work out, is it an actual language deficit, an understanding deficit, or is it a language barrier? And that's why when you repeat the test the year after, you will be able to see, after putting in all your interventions, is it an understanding issue or is it just a language issue? And that's how we would overcome areas like that. And I'm just going to pass on now to Asma.
Now I'll be talking about how the secondary school is using the CAT4 and other GL assessment data to inform teaching and learning in target setting. In the secondary school, a UK curriculum is taught, and students prepare for the IGCSE, AS and A-level examinations. As Susan mentioned before, it's an inclusive school, so students' starting points are widely spread and diverse. However, there's a basic expectation that every student will make excellent progress in their learning, regardless of their starting point. Monitoring progress then becomes very important because students of the same age and year level can be at very different stages in their learning. Using GL assessments has allowed the senior leadership team to shift the focus of conversations around outcomes from the number of A's achieved to value added and progress made. Defining successful learning in terms of the progress that individuals make, regardless of their starting point. The data supports evidence for self-evaluation and target setting on a school-wide level. As Susan mentioned, the NGRT data has helped the primary school leaders set literacy targets. In secondary, in addition to NGRT, CAT4 and progress test data allows teachers to compare students' potential and their current attainment, giving valuable insight into the identification of gifted and talented, as well as underperforming students. Conclusions and decisions regarding teaching and learning, continued professional development, and improvement priorities are now based on robust evidence, not opinions or assumptions. Now, experienced teachers can make informed estimates of what an individual student is likely to achieve by the end of a year or key stage based on their professional expertise and knowledge of what has already been achieved. In the past, IGCSE and A levels and AS teachers at the school used to give predicted grades or targets for students based solely on internal assessment results and their knowledge of the students. Now, GL data can support the teacher's judgment and in some cases, as Jen mentioned earlier, reveal hidden talents. Along with the standard age scores and student profiles, CAT4 reports include indicators of the most likely grade a student will achieve at IGCSE, as well as an aspirational grade that the student might achieve if challenged. And you can have the same pointers or indicators for IB as well. Using CAT4 standard age scores and key stage indicators, we're looking at how we can start using flight paths, such as the one shown here, to map the students' expected progress based on their starting points. All students will not follow the same path. For example, according to this flight path, a student with a standard age score of 100 at the beginning of Key Stage 3 is set a GCSE target grade of around 6 or B. Another student with a starting point of 120 is set a target grade of 9 or A star, and so on. The CAT4 indicators are used as the initial target for the student at the end of the key stage. The flight path then maps the shortest pathway from the starting point to the target. Milestones are put in place to indicate where the student is expected to be at the end of each academic year or maybe each term. The challenge now is to quantify the milestones in terms of robust internal assessments. Potentially, these milestones could be measured based on attainment data such as the progress test data, but that can only be done at the end of each academic year. This allows the teachers to monitor each student's progress and put interventions in place if it's not on track. It's important to set achievable but aspirational targets, especially if these are shared with students or parents, because we don't want to limit their aspirations. Teacher judgment should be considered before setting any targets, as teachers know their students best. If shared with students and parents, targets can also be an excellent tool to give students ownership of their own learning. A flight path is a visual representation showing the possible pathway for expected progress, better than expected progress, and exceptional progress. It's one way of creating a common language and common measures for target setting. It's very important to remember that individual students will have individual progress rates, and there's no expectation that the path will be linear. The line is simply a representation, as we said before, of the shortest path from beginning to target. If a student's actual attainment, the progress test scores, for example, or internal end-of-year examinations at different checkpoints is monitored, interventions can then be put in place as soon as a problem is identified. As the example shows, if progress is below what is expected, then progress will not be linear and it will not happen at a regular rate. If the student's assessment results or progress test score in math shows that he's underachieving, the teachers can then investigate. They can look at the NGRT results or maybe attitudinal survey data to find out what the problem is and discuss the student with other team members in order to plan suitable interventions. Now, one way that the secondary school that we work with in Riyadh capture or record all this information is such spreadsheets as shown in this slide. They allow teachers to track a student's progress, but also record other relevant assessment data that might reveal possible barriers. As you can see here, for example, you have the NGRT data, past data, and they're RAG rated, just to signal or flag any issues that need to be investigated further, as well as the CAT4 IGCSE indicators or targets. Now, another way is comparing CAT4 and progress test scores is another way of monitoring progress in the core subjects, which are English, math, and science. The combination CAT4 and progress test reports also identify students whose progress is not on track. Analysis of such combination data by cohorts or groups or gender, for example, allows middle and senior leaders to identify priorities for improvement. For example, based on the analysis of the progress test and math data at the end of Key Stage 2, the percentage of students achieving lower than expected in math allowed the senior leaders to identify gaps in the math curriculum, as Susan mentioned earlier. And so they put a plan in place to improve the students' readiness for the transition from the Australian curriculum in the primary to the UK curriculum in the lower high school. GL assessments, they produce a wealth of data. We use the tracking spreadsheets to record relevant and important information. We plan interventions based on assessment data and conversations with other staff members, with senior leaders, middle leaders. However, the impact of such interventions must be monitored continuously and discussed in staff meetings or puzzles of practice to evaluate what is working and what is not working. It's still the school's second year with GL assessments, and we don't have enough data, but in future, year-on-year progress test data will allow more effective monitoring and measurement of progress in all year groups, not only at the end of the key stages, so that exceptional impact can be highlighted and evidence-based best practice will be shared and replicated. So at the moment, CAT4 indicators are compared to external examination results and analyzed to produce value-added charts, such as the one you see on this slide. These clearly identify outliers and they allow the middle leaders to ask the right questions. For example, in the middle graph on this slide, there are two boys who have achieved less than the predicted results, predicted by CAT4 or indicated by CAT4. Teachers are then expected to investigate further, to look more closely at the students' CAT4 learner profiles, their NGRT results, in addition to their attitudinal survey results, to plan interventions and bring the students back on track. This analysis also supports teaching and learning best practice and teacher evaluation conversations. For example, the graphs on this slide represent 3 different IGCSE physics classes. Comparing the first one and the third graph, the head of the science department then asked, what is happening in the first class that's not happening in the third one? Why is there more value added in the first class and not in the third? How can best practice in the first class be identified and shared then? As well as raising these kind of questions for staff discussions, the data will now help us create targets relating to the effects that teachers and our school as a whole are expected to have on students' learning. The language of target setting will now shift from attainment percentages, as you can see here. That's how we used to do our action planning or set our targets for the whole school. So instead of these percentages, we will now shift to expected value added, or maybe effect size. These will be aspirational targets for us, but they will be achievable and meaningful to the school's context, taking into consideration the diversity of our student population. Finally, this shift in focus from achievement to value added and effect size and progress will require support from all stakeholders, including parents. Now, the senior leadership team at the school is committed to this initiative. However, parents in an international school context, as you may have experienced, are driven by achievement grades. Changing their mindset to ensure their support of it will be our next challenge. Thank you for your time.